Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room. I hope you're well today, guys. We're going to be looking at an interesting topic, I think, partly because it's a topic that has fruitful possibilities, but I think could benefit from a more logical clarification. And as you know, I like my logical clarifications. So before we start looking at the reasons why INFJs tend to get on very well with ENFPs, and to some extent ENTPs as well. Just to remind you that if you haven't gotten hold of The Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, the most in-depth study of the type, really, available online if you want to bring your understanding of the INFJ to the next level. Less than $10 available below in the description box. The links, Amazon links to ebook and paperback format. You help me, I help you. Okay, so this topic is so interesting because I think that the idea captures something very true, which means that if you look at the empirical data derived from your experience, you'll often notice that INFJs get on remarkably well with ENFPs. There seems to be an attraction between those two types. And also with ENTPs. There's equally an attraction between those two types, which can be a little bit trickier at times when the TI of the ENTP is a lot more developed than the TI of the INFJ. Because in this case, sometimes the ENTP might come across as a little bit too cold, perhaps, or too impersonal and detached. Insofar as an ENTP's TI being auxiliary is much more likely to be well differentiated, whereas in the case of the INFJ, because TI is tertiary, it's kind of up to the INFJ, their inclinations, their environment, the way that they've decided to lead their lives that will determine whether the TI is developed. But in any case, let's assume that INFJs do get on really well with ENFPs and ENTPs, and that we have plenty of real life examples to confirm this. So it's not just a matter of getting on well with, is this background of mutual appreciation and understanding. It's as if the types are speaking each other's language, but not in the sense in which an INFJ might relate to another INFJ. And that's important to understand the distinction. When an INFJ speaks to another INFJ, in some way there is the reassuring comfort of having a mirror of yourself. With an ENFP or an ENTP, it's not so much the reassuring comfort of having a mirror into your own soul, and in a sense the confirmation that you're not alone. It's more this idea that your discourse and the way in which you make sense of yourself feels as if it's enhanced when you're in conversation with an ENP type. There's a sense in which finally you can start to visualize what you're on about by getting this reflection back from the ENP type. So it's not a mirroring effect, it's almost more like an enhancing effect, an adding of color to your discourse. A discourse that until then might have been a little bit of a mix of clarity and fuzziness, and suddenly all becomes more bubbly, all becomes more colorful, all begins to make the maximum meaning that it had in potential. How can that happen, and how can we explain that happens? I promised at the start of the video that I would try to give a logical explanation, a clear explanation, and not something that relies on, oh, these types are made to understand each other because the extrovert feeds the introvert and the NE feeds the NI and blah, blah, blah. I mean, of course, what I'm going to explain goes kind of in that direction because that direction captures something correct, but I'm going to try to get to a level that's a bit more granular, a level that's a little bit more transparent, as it were. My thesis is this. Obviously, ENFPs and ENTPs are dominant intuitives, just like the INFJ is. And they are they're inferior sensors, just like the INFJ is. And the big difference is that instead of being on the SE-NI axis, or the NI-SE axis, they are on the NE-SI axis. Now my thesis is the following. NE, as manifested by the ENP type, is experienced by the INFJ as some kind of materialization of what goes on inside their own minds, subjectively speaking, at the level of introverted intuition. And conversely, what the INFJ manifests as dominant NI looks to the ENP also what goes on inside their own minds, at the level, in this case, of SI. And so this is a little bit of a complex point to make, but I'm going to try to unpack it now. The INFJ gathers information in the outside world like any type has to do if they are to survive. So they use SE for this purpose, and I have made a video clarifying SE recently. But they're not very conscious of how they gather external objects into fact via the SE function. They're much more aware of the patterns they detect in what has been accumulated via NI, but because the pattern detection is oriented to something that's not completely known in advance, it often feels as if NI is kind of filling holes, trying to complete a canvas that was never completed in the first place. Now that gives obviously the INFJ their specific quality of knowing things without really knowing them, being able to predict things without being able to explain why, but it's also a source of a relative alienation of the INFJ from the world itself, and this is a point that I make several times in the book. The thing is, in the ENFP, they find something that looks a little bit like NI coming to grips with an SE that they themselves cannot experience. So they experience NI coming to grips with itself. They don't experience NI coming to grips with SE because SE is mostly unconscious. And my thesis is that when they see the play of association and the creativity that is so evident in the manipulation of the any function, they capture something like the experience they have of the processing by introverted intuition of the material of the external worlds that initially was gathered by SE. It doesn't happen when they're interacting with an SE dominant, and that's the important point to make, because when they are dealing with an SE dominant, what they are seeing is SE. They're not seeing a lot of intuition in the SE dominant. And what they're trying to give a voice to is what they're subjectively experienced and not easy to share, which is their NI. So there's a very intuitive quality to that process and how it, manipulates, processes the SE facts that they have gathered in the first place. But the primary agency of what's inside them is introverted intuition, is the function of introverted perception. So NE is much more apt to combine this gathering of facts in the external world in a fluid way, which is what INFJs do with material that is not in the external world, material that has been supplied by SE but has been turned into an inner image. So by being exposed to NI sees a reflection of what it would look like if it was externalized. And I think that is extremely relatable and pleasurable and rewarding for an INFJ to notice, because it is a kind of testament of their own intuition, but given an objective reality. And for the ENP, whether ENFP or NTP, it's the same thing, but in reverse, because the ENFP is highly aware of the gathering of facts in the external world, precisely what the INFJ is not aware of. But what they're not really aware of is their process of introverted sensing. And that's because it's mostly unconscious for the ENP. So what they're not particularly aware of is also the function that the ENP is, in some certain sense, closest to in terms of inner perception, because inner perception is a subjective function, it's the function of either SI or NI. So the ENP would like to be close to that function because it is intimately related to the analysis of the inner image, but at the same time, it's very hard for them to come to grips with it. If they were dealing with an SI user, a dominant SI user, it's a bit like the INFJ and the SE user. It wouldn't really work because in the case of the dominant SI user, there is quite a pronounced repression of the intuitive function, and it wouldn't do justice to how the ENP, not completely consciously, processes, sure, via SI, the data gathered in a highly conscious and dynamic manner by extroverted intuition. So again, there's an interplay between SI and NE that is dominated by NE, even though the agency of the processing is to SI, the structuring is to SI, but NE is so much more conscious that it's the one that's making SI dynamic. So if an ENP is going to be talking to an SI dominant, they will not find this dynamism that they're relying on. And they will not find the reflection of what goes on inside them. Whereas if they're talking to an INFJ, what they can see when the INFJ speaks is clearly sentences that are spoken, at least when the INFJ is in their environment, and there's nothing better than to be with an ENP to feel like you're in an environment or a dominant intuitive of any kind. INFJs are going to have statements that sound like NI statements. That sounds like statements of processing that are dealing with data in the external world that has not been consciously gathered. So the statements of NI are always going to have this element of intuitive mystery to them. And I think that to the ENP, those statements are going to be like a vindication, an expression of what goes on inside, their own thought processes when they're doing the SI processing of their NI intuitions. Because of their NE intuitions, obviously it's NE intuitions. So when SI is attempting to process the gathering of NE, if you picture this and imagine it being expressed in conversation, this would be almost a little bit like what sounds like NI. And so the NASI pattern of the ENFP finds a voice, strangely enough, in NI statements by INFJ. And conversely, the SC and I patterns of the INFJ find a voice in the NE statements of the ENP. And it's obviously a case of similarity, a case of metaphoricity. It's not a case of complete symmetry because these are different functions. But I think it's a very satisfying experience for an INFJ to see the NI interaction with SC materialized in something that looks like it in any statements of ENPs, and the reverse for ENPs to see the SI NE interaction being materialized in something like an NI statement that looks like it's a materialization of that very intimate but very internal process. Complicated explanation perhaps, but I think it holds a clue to understanding why these two or these three types get on so well together, because they always are interacting against this background of a shared and self-enhancing understanding. Consider subscribing, give me a like, and I'll see you soon, guys. Bye bye.